What if the space between us is not empty? Part of the thinking library. The What If series, Volume 2. Introduction. The silence that speaks. Two people sit across from each other, close enough to speak, yet separated by something neither of them can name. No words are exchanged. No movement breaks the stillness. And yet, something is happening. A quiet tension lingers in the air. A presence that cannot be seen, but can be felt. An invisible weight pressing gently between them. You felt this before. That moment when silence becomes loud. When a glance carries more meaning than a sentence. When the space between you and someone else feels full. Not empty. But what exactly is filling it? We are taught, from the very beginning, to trust what we can see. Objects, bodies, distance. We learn that space is simply the absence of things. A gap, a void, nothing. But human experience tells a different story, because the space between people has never truly felt like nothing. It feels charged, responsive, alive. Think about it. Why does tension linger after an argument, even when no one is speaking? Why can a room feel heavy, just because of who is in it? Why can someone sit beside you, physically close, and yet feel impossibly far away? And how is it that someone miles away can feel closer than the person right in front of you? There is something happening in that space. Something subtle. Something we all sense, but rarely question. Maybe the distance between us is not just physical. Maybe it is psychological, emotional, even imaginative. Maybe the space between two people is not empty at all, but filled with thoughts, expectations, interpretations, and silent conversations that never reach the surface. Every look, every pause, every unspoken word adds something to that space. And over time, that invisible space begins to shape everything. How we connect, how we misunderstand, how we feel seen or unseen. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Distance. We move through life as if we are separate, distinct, self-contained, defined by the boundaries of our bodies. You are where you stand. I am where I stand. And between us, there is distance. That is what we see. That is what we measure. That is what we trust. But experience has a way of quietly challenging that belief. Because there are moments, subtle, almost easy to ignore, when distance doesn't behave the way it should. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and suddenly, they feel close. Not physically, not visibly, but undeniably present. You sit next to someone, close enough to touch, and yet something feels off, as if there is a quiet barrier between you. Something invisible, but real enough to notice. So what exactly are we calling distance? Is it simply space? A measurable gap between two bodies? Or is it something else? Something shaped more by perception than by reality? The physicist Albert Einstein once described human separation as a kind of optical delusion of consciousness, a way of seeing that feels convincing, but may not reflect the deeper truth. And while his words emerge from science, they echo powerfully in human experience. Because connection, as we live it, does not follow physical rules. You can feel someone's presence without them being in the room. You can sense tension before a single word is spoken. You can walk into a space and immediately know something is wrong, not because you observed it clearly, but because you felt it instantly. So again, what is distance? If two people are miles apart, but thinking of each other at the same moment, are they truly distant? And if two people sit side by side, sharing no emotional connection at all, are they truly close? Maybe distance is not a fixed reality. Maybe it is a surface-level interpretation, a way of organizing what we can see, while overlooking what we can feel. Because beneath the visible world, something else is happening, something quieter, less obvious, but far more influential, a form of connection that doesn't require touch, or proximity, or even interaction. It moves through attention, through memory, through awareness, and it exists whether we acknowledge it or not. If that's true, then what we call separation may not actually separate us. It may only describe what appears on the surface, because underneath that appearance, something continuous remains, something shared, and that changes everything. Because if distance is not absolute, if it is shaped by perception, emotion, and attention, then the space between us is not just a gap to be crossed. It is a place where something is already happening, something active, something responsive, something filled with signals we don't fully understand, which leads to a deeper realization. Maybe we have misunderstood distance. Maybe it is not what keeps us apart. Maybe it is simply the space where connection takes form. And if that's the case, then the space between us has never been empty. It has been speaking all along. Chapter 2. The Invisible Conversation. Not every conversation is spoken. In fact, some of the most important ones never use words at all. Two people sit across from each other. One finally breaks the silence and says, "I'm fine." The sentence is simple, clear, complete, and yet something doesn't settle. Because the words say one thing, but the space between them says something else. There is a pause that lingers just a moment too long, a shift in posture that feels almost unintentional. Eyes that meet, then quietly look away, and suddenly, meaning begins to move. Outside the boundaries of language, we are taught to trust words, to believe that communication is carried through what is said, clearly and directly. But human interaction has never been that simple, because beneath every spoken sentence, there is another layer, one that moves faster than speech and deeper than logic, a layer made of signals we don't consciously send, but constantly reveal. A tightening of the voice, a breath that changes rhythm, a silence that stretches just slightly longer than expected, and somehow the other person notices, not by analyzing, not by carefully thinking it through, but by feeling it. This is the invisible conversation. It unfolds in real time, between expression and perception, between what is shown and what is sensed, and it fills the space between us completely. Every interaction carries more than one message. There is what you say, there is what you mean, and then there is what the other person understands. 3 layers, one moment, all existing at once. And when those layers align, connection feels effortless. But when they don't, something begins to shift. Confusion enters, tension builds, distance appears. Not physical distance, but something harder to explain. Because the space between people is not just filled with signals, it is filled with interpretation. Instant, automatic, and often invisible. A tone becomes a message. A pause becomes a conclusion. A glance becomes a story. And just like that, meaning begins to multiply. Why did they say it like that? Did they mean something else? Are they holding something back? These questions rarely leave the mind. They remain unspoken, yet they shape everything. This is why silence can feel so intense. Because when words disappear, interpretation expands. The mind begins to fill the space on its own, completing the conversation without confirmation, and often it fills that space with uncertainty, or doubt, or projection, and yet we trust it, because this invisible layer of communication feels immediate, instinctive, real, sometimes more real than the words themselves, which means something important is happening. The space between us is not just carrying communication, it is shaping it. It determines how words are received, how meaning is formed, how connection is either strengthened or quietly weakened. And if that's true, then every interaction we have is only partly visible. The rest is happening silently, in expressions, in pauses, in everything we sense but cannot fully explain. So even when nothing is being said, the conversation never stops. It simply moves into the space between us. Chapter 3. The field between us. Walk into a room, and before anyone speaks, you already know something. You can't point to it. You can't explain it clearly. No one has said a word. And yet, the atmosphere feels different. Heavier somehow. Tighter. As if something unresolved is quietly present in the air. Or sometimes the opposite. The space feels open, relaxed, almost inviting. You find yourself at ease, without knowing why. We describe these moments casually. Something feels off. The energy is good. The vibe is strange. Simple phrases, easy to dismiss. But what if they are pointing to something real? Not something mystical or abstract in a distant sense, but something directly experienced. Because between every two people, there seems to exist more than just empty space. Something dynamic, something responsive, a kind of field, not a field you can see, but one you can step into. And once you enter it, you are affected by it. Think about moments of tension. Two people stand apart, saying nothing, yet everyone nearby feels it. The silence sharpens. The air tightens. Attention gathers without invitation. Nothing visible has changed, but everything feels different. Now think about a different moment. Two people are laughing, comfortable, at ease with each other, and suddenly, the space around them opens. Others are drawn in. The atmosphere softens. Even silence feels light. Again, nothing dramatic has happened. No clear signal. No obvious cause. And yet, the environment has changed. So what is happening? It's more than communication. More. A hesitation can tighten it. A moment of honesty can soften it. It responds not only to what is done, but to what is felt. And no single person controls it. Because it is co-created, formed between people, not owned by either one. Which is why connection cannot be forced. You can say the right words, follow the right steps, do everything expected of you, and still feel something missing. Because the field does not respond to performance. It responds to presence. And presence cannot be sustained artificially. Over time, what is genuine shapes the field, and what is not fades or creates tension. So the space between us is not passive. It is not empty. It is alive, constantly shifting, constantly responding, constantly becoming something. Sometimes it pulls people closer. Sometimes it creates distance. But it is always active, always shaping the experience of being together, which leads to a deeper realization. Connection is not something we build from nothing. It is something we enter, a shared space, already in motion, and the moment we step into it, we become part of what it becomes. Chapter 4. When presence defies distance. There are people who are not in the room, and yet they are not absent. You don't see them. You don't hear their voice. You don't feel their touch. And still, they are there, in a thought that returns without effort, in a memory that doesn't ask for permission, in a quiet awareness that stays with you, even when everything else has moved on. How is that possible? How can someone be physically distant and yet feel emotionally present? We tend to define presence by location. If you are here, you are present. If you are not, you are gone. It feels logical. It feels certain. But human experience rarely follows that logic, because presence, as we feel it, does not depend on proximity. You can sit in a crowded room, filled with voices, movement, and noise, and still feel completely alone. At the same time, you can be by yourself, in silence, and feel deeply accompanied, not by imagination alone, but by something that feels shared, something that continues, even in absence. Think about someone who has mattered to you, someone whose presence has shaped how you see the world. Even when they are not physically near, they influence your thoughts. They shape your reactions. They remain part of your awareness. It's as if a part of them exists within the space around you, not as a physical form, but as a relational presence. And when something reminds you of them, a place, a song, a simple moment, that space between you becomes active again. You feel it instantly. A message appears on your phone. Their name lights up the screen. And in that moment, distance collapses. The room feels different. Your attention narrows. Your emotional state shifts. Nothing physical has changed. And yet, everything feels closer. So what changed? Not the miles between you. Not the physical reality. What changed is what moved through the space. Because the space between people is not limited by distance. It stretches. It carries what has been shared, conversations, memories, meaning, and holds them in a way that does not fade easily. This is why some connections endure across time and space, why some people never truly feel far away, and why others, even when physically close, can feel unreachable, because proximity is not the same as connection, and absence is not the same as disconnection. The space between us does not disappear when we part. It changes form. It becomes quieter, less visible, but still present, still carrying something, still capable of being felt, which leads to a deeper realization. Presence is not something we bring into space. It is something that moves through it. And if that's true, then the space between us is not defined by how far apart we are, but by what continues to exist within it. Chapter 5. The stories that fill the space. If the space between us is not empty, then it is always being filled, but not always with truth. Sometimes it is filled with stories. You send a message, minutes pass, then hours. No reply. At first, it means very little. Maybe they're busy. Maybe they haven't seen it. But as time stretches, the space between you begins to change. You notice the silence. You return to it. You begin to sit inside it. And slowly, meaning begins to form. Did I say something wrong? Are they ignoring me? Did something change between us? Nothing new has actually happened. No words have been added. No explanation has been given. And yet, the space between you is no longer neutral. It has been filled, not with facts, but with interpretation. This is how quickly the mind responds to uncertainty. It does not like open space. It does not rest comfortably in the unknown. So it creates. It builds explanations. It fills silence with possibility. And often, with fear. A delayed response becomes rejection. A short reply becomes disinterest. A pause becomes distance. And without realizing it, we begin to react to a version of reality that may not exist at all. This is how the space between people becomes distorted, not because of what was said, but because of what was assumed. And once those assumptions settle in, they begin to shape everything. Your tone changes. Your openness tightens. Your presence becomes cautious. The field between you shifts, subtly but noticeably, not because the other person changed, but because your interpretation did. And the most difficult part is this. The other person may be doing the exact same thing, filling the same space, with a completely different story. Two people, one shared space, two separate realities, each responding to what they believe is happening, and neither fully aware of the gap between truth and assumption. This is how misunderstandings grow, quietly, gradually, without a clear beginning. No argument, no clear conflict, just layers of interpretation, building over time, until the space between two people no longer feels open, but heavy, complicated, distant. And yet, if you look closely, nothing concrete may have caused it. Only stories, unspoken, unverified, but deeply felt. So the space between us is not just alive, it is impressionable. It becomes what we place into it. Clarity, or confusion, trust, or doubt, presence, or projection. And over time, What we consistently place there becomes what we experience, which leads to a quiet realization. The space between us is not only where connection lives, it is also where it can be lost, not through distance, not through silence, but through the stories we allow to settle there. And if that's true, then understanding each other may not begin with speaking more, but with questioning what we have already assumed in the silence between us. Conclusion: the space that connects everything. We began with a simple question: what if the space between us is not empty? And now, after everything we've explored, it no longer feels like a question. It feels like something you've already experienced, because you've felt it, in silence that carried meaning, in distance that didn't feel like distance, in moments where something invisible changed everything. We often imagine connection as something we must create, something built through words, through effort, through time. But what if connection is not something we build? What if it is something that is already there, waiting to be noticed? Because the space between us has never been empty. It has always been active, filled with signals, shaped by presence, carrying emotions, interpretations, and unspoken exchanges. It holds tension, it holds warmth, it holds memory, and sometimes it holds misunderstanding. But in every case, it is doing something, quietly, constantly, without asking for attention. And maybe that's why we overlook it, because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply exists between every glance, every word, every silence. And yet, it shapes everything: how we connect, how we drift apart, how we feel seen or unseen. So perhaps the question is no longer whether the space between us is empty, but what we are placing into it. Because that space is not fixed. It responds to attention, to emotion, to honesty or avoidance. It becomes what we allow it to become: a bridge or a barrier, a place of understanding or a place of confusion. And often, without realizing it, we are shaping it together, in real time, with every interaction, with every silence, with every assumption we leave unexamined. So what would change if we became aware of it? If we recognized that the moment between speaking and being understood is not empty, but alive? Maybe we would listen more carefully, not just to words, but to what surrounds them. Maybe we would pause before assuming, before filling silence with conclusions that were never confirmed. Maybe we would begin to see that connection is not about eliminating distance, but about understanding what exists within it. Because in the end, we are not separated by space. We are connected through it. And the distance we feel is not always a matter of how far apart we are, but how unaware we are of what is already there. So the next time you find yourself sitting across from someone in silence, pay attention, not just to what is said, but to what is present. Because the space between you is speaking, and it always has been.